Right, so this is the first video of the lecture for organelles and cell structure. We're going to look at the cell theory. Right, so before even looking at the cell theory, right, we are going to look at what is considered a living organism, what is considered alive. Right, so for a living organism to be considered a living organism alive, the living organism must display 7 characteristics. I call them 7 characteristics of life. Right, the first is to display order, right, in the form of organized structures. So look at the cell, for example, right? A cell has a particular shape, that is organized structure, order. The cell contains at least the cell surface membrane, and the membrane has a particular structure, right? The cell contains proteins, and the protein structures are all maintained. So that is an example of displaying order. Next, there should be homeostasis, the maintenance of a constant internal environment. So I'm going to use the example of a cell again, right? Inside the cell, the internal environment refers to the cytoplasm. There is the maintenance of the concentration, the water potential of the cytoplasm, right? And if you look bigger at a human body, for example, obviously we have the internal body temperature and things like that, which are all maintained. So that's homeostasis. A living organism should be able to respond to stimuli from the environment, right? So I don't think I need to explain this. Next, a living organism should be able to display heredity, meaning to pass down the genome, the genetic materials, during reproduction. Yeah. A living organism should be able to acquire energy either from the sun via photosynthesis, from food, right, via respiration, process the energy, and use the energy to do our daily work, and the rest of all these characteristics of life, right, which all most of them require energy. Yeah. That's how we already mentioned the heredity, which is a bit linked to reproduction. So the living organism should be able to reproduce and evolve to adapt to the environment. Okay, so a living organism, for something to be considered alive, should display all these 7 characteristics. Right. So for example, if your room is not in order, right, you are always unkempt, that is not a characteristic of life, because you are not showing organization, right? If you are called to answer questions and you don't, then that's not responding to stimuli, right? So usually we describe you as being dead, right? So it has a bio basis to it. Okay. Anyway, you all should be all alive, right? Just that you choose not to do certain things. Okay, so you should be able to display all these 7 characteristics of life. Okay, with that, now we move on to the cell theory. Looking at the first principle, all living organisms are composed of 1 or more cells. So if I break down this principle, right, and maybe rephrase it, what it really is saying is something that display the 7 characteristics of life. So this something would be considered a living organism, right? So this living organism must be made up of cells. Maybe 1 cell, then that would be a unicellular organism or single-celled organism. Examples would be our bacteria, right? Yeast, which is actually a unicellular eukaryote. Amoebas, which is also unicellular eukaryote, right? So all these are unicellular organisms. So by 1 cell, each of these 1 cell is able to display these 7 characteristics of life. Of course, the living organism can be composed of more than 1 cell, right? So that would be a multicellular organism. Then obviously examples are us, right? Your animals, plants, and so on. All right. So again, in more layman term, what the first principle is saying is, if I look at you, you display 7 characteristics of life. That means you are a living organism. then straight away I know that you should have cells inside you lah, or you should be made up of cells. That is what the first principle is saying. Okay, so there are obviously a lot of things that are not made of cells, right? For example, our computer is not made of cells, right? Your clock on the wall is not made of cells, but all these things are not living organisms, right? Because they don't display the 7 characteristics of life. Yeah, so again, right, if you see something that you considered alive based on the characteristics of life, then the assumption is this living organism should be made up of cells. So if you find something that you consider alive but is not made up of cells, then that's where the cell theory is wrong. Yeah, but so far it is still standing. Yeah, so it's still correct lah. Okay, now move on to principle 2. The cell is the smallest and most basic unit of life. Okay, so again, if I break it down what the principle is saying, yeah, it basically is saying that the cell is the smallest, most basic, the simplest entity that can display the 7 characteristics of life. And this is true for our unicellular organisms, right? Because one cell is one life, so this one cell is able to do all 7 characteristics of life, right? This one cell is able to reproduce, this one cell is able to respond to stimuli, this one cell is able to evolve, adapt, so on and so forth. Okay, but for us as multicellular organism, right, one cell, like let's say I take out one of my skin cell, for example, then obviously the skin cell doesn't reproduce. It may divide, but it doesn't reproduce in terms of having children, right? Yeah. So because for us as a multicellular organism, our reproduction, our evolution, so on and so forth are a bit different. Right, so one cell may not be able to do all 7 characteristics of life, but me as a person is able to do all 7 characteristics of life. And as a person, if you zoom in to my body, you will see organs. If you zoom into the organs, you will see tissues. If you zoom into the tissues, you will see cells. And that cell, one cell, is the most basic building block of tissues, organs, and therefore the body, me, right? The most basic building block or the smallest functional unit. Yep. So can we zoom inside the cell and just say a nucleus? Right, a nucleus is even more basic, right, and even smaller than a cell, right? But a nucleus is not functional, right? On its own, a nucleus doesn't function, right? It takes a cell to function, right? So that's why the cell is the smallest functional unit or the most basic building block for me as a multicellular organism. So this is what principle 2 is basically saying, right? That for something to display all 7 characteristics of life, the most simplest form it can be is one cell. And for a multicellular organism, one cell is the most basic unit, the most basic functional unit or building block. Yeah, so this is what statement 2 is saying. Right, so you can imagine again, are there things that are smaller than a cell? Are there things that are more basic than a cell? Of course, right? I just mentioned a nucleus is more basic than one cell, but a nucleus doesn't display all 7 characteristics of life, right? Water molecule is smaller than a cell, but it doesn't display any characteristics of life. Right? A protein is smaller than a cell, but it doesn't display the characteristics of life. Right? The smallest, most basic thing that can display these 7 characteristics of life is one cell. Right? So this is what the second principle is saying. Okay? The third principle would be a bit more straightforward, right? That cells grow from pre-existing cells, meaning new daughter cells come about from the division of an existing parental cell. Yeah, so you can see that in this GIF, right? This is the parental cell existing. Now it's undergoing cell division into 2 daughter cells. Right, so a cell cannot come about spontaneously. A cell cannot come about out of nowhere. right? There must be an existing cell which divides into 2 new daughter cells. Okay, so this is or these are the 3 principles of the cell theory.